Morning, and welcome to the Atlantic Council's discussion on offshore wind in Asia. I'm Joe Webster, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to be joined by three experts on offshore wind who have rich experiences across Asia and the Asian offshore wind market. Before we dive in, I'll make some housekeeping remarks, provide some initial context, and introduce our panelists. This is a public virtual event that is on the record. There will be a question and answer session later in the discussion, and you can ask a question through Zoom. Before I turn to our panelists, however, I'll provide some brief context on the global offshore wind industry. So offshore wind projects have taken a hit in recent months. Bloomberg NEF New Energy Finance calculates that the cost of a typical U.S. offshore wind project before bonus tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act are accounted for has increased by about 57% since 2021. Increases in component and labor costs, along with rising interest rates, are pressuring the economics of offshore wind projects. European wind projects have not been immune to these cost pressures, as a UK industry group warned the industry faces a, quote, tipping point, unquote, in the construction of new sites absent government intervention. On the other hand, offshore wind is making substantial progress and turbines are being installed across the world. This week could see the construction of the world's largest offshore wind turbine in Massachusetts. And Asian markets continue to account for the majority of the world's installations of new offshore wind turbines in terms of capacity. In this discussion, we'll further unpack Asia's offshore wind markets and identify lessons learned and best practices which we can apply to both the US market as well as the European market. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. First of all, we have a wonderful group here. So happy to have all of you join us. Megan Smith is on our panel. She leads the offshore wind advisory team at Carbon Trust, focusing on providing policy and industrial strategy advice to industry and the public sector globally. Megan's also a policy fellow of Cambridge University through the Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy. She holds degrees from Imperial College London and Bristol University and spent several years working for the UK government as a senior policy analyst, developing the UK's offshore transmission regime before joining the Carbon Trust in 2013. So Megan, thank you. Wonderful to have you here today. Angelica Wang is the founding editor of Offshore Wind Unredacted, a publication focusing on the development of Taiwan's offshore wind industry. She also writes about geopolitics, and specifically Taiwan, at her Substack, Typology. Before founding Offshore Wind Unredacted, Angelica was a business reporter at the Taipei Times. Angelica has deep connections across Taiwan's offshore wind space and helps to bridge the English and Chinese language divide. Angelica, wonderful to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Shayak Sengupta is a fellow at Observer Research Foundation America, or ORF America, where he leads research on energy, climate, and sustainability related to the United States, India, and their partners. As part of Dr. Sengupta's work, he analyzes technology, finance, and policy developments between the two countries with broader implications for the global energy transition. Previously, Dr. Sengupta served as a visiting researcher at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, which is formerly Brookings, India, in New Delhi, and was also a Fulbright Nehru Scholar at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur. Shayak, thank you for joining us today. Wonderful to have all of you today. And Megan, I'll turn to you first. So you've worked across projects, technological innovation, and policy in Japan, Taiwan, and mainland China, not to mention the United States, United Kingdom, Colombia, and Ireland. So you have a wealth of comparative knowledge. And I was wondering if you could please share some reflections on what aspects of Asia's offshore wind market do you find unique?
Yeah, thank you for having me. There are lots of things I could talk about, but maybe just to highlight a few for this session. So obviously the local manufacturing capability is kind of exceptional in East Asia. A lot of the UK and wider European components are manufactured and shipped over, so there's a really strong supply chain. We've also seen, and more on the kind of policy side, we're sort of seeing that there's been a lot of kind of understanding of what's been happening within Europe, which is obviously a much more advanced market in terms of sort of capacity and install, and what has been to date, and really learning from what has and what hasn't worked within Europe. And sort of looking at maybe Japan, especially, we're seeing a lot of recent updates to their sort of policy regimes, their marine spatial planning, really looking to adapt and update the processes to optimize the market, because those kind of wider structural things can really have a massive impact on the viability of the local market. So I think that's a really positive thing that we're seeing, that kind of flexibility and understanding of what works and what doesn't work in other markets, and then applying it to the local context. Because obviously, even if something works in the UK or in the US, for example, it's not necessarily going to work in other markets. So really understanding what those impacts are and how to optimize within the local market is really important. And then, I mean, finally, obviously, the fact that floating offshore wind is going to be significantly prominent within the market, more so than certainly the European market, and comparing to the US market, very much will be looking more like the West Coast type than the East. So I think floating wind is going to be a really interesting development, and obviously a focus for the market development.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I think we'll touch on floating wind later, but those are some great points. And, as you mentioned, Asia's leading in terms of new installs, but Europe is also a very mature and sophisticated market for offshore wind, as you mentioned as well. And then that is important about the local manufacturing capability and supply chain. That's something we're struggling in the US, is, to really build out a domestic supply chain. And we will talk on localization in a bit. So, Angelica, I'll turn to you next. And so, we mentioned the importance of, we mentioned some of the markets in Asia. Mainland China is a very prominent market, but also Taiwan has a lot of offshore wind capacity. So at the end of 2021, Taiwan was, with the exception, obviously, of mainland China, was the region's leader in terms of offshore wind capacity deployment. So to put that in context, Taiwan has deployed about 1,400 megawatts, or about 30 times greater than what the US has installed to date. I know there's a lot more that should be done, and I know you have a lot to say about some of the things that should be done in Taiwan, but what has Taiwan gotten right in terms of its offshore wind deployment?
I would say, first of all, we're not at that number yet. Maybe by the end of the season, we might be, because a few projects are behind schedule. But I would say what the Taiwanese government really got right was that top-level direction. They really made it very clear, all the players in the market, that Taiwan is putting a stake in the ground, and we are committed to being to volume, to support, to make this a big part of our energy strategy. And then they really took ownership of this technology. I would say that President Tsai made it her signature policy in energy, and she championed it. She talked about it, she raised it up, and she made it a comprehensive political tool, in that, yes, it's energy, but it's also providing green energy so our industry can have low carbon energy that they need. And it's also providing jobs, and it's providing us with a potential export industry in the future. She did that in a way that truly established offshore wind in a very positive light in the mind of a lot of the people, but it also sowed the seeds of some problems later on, as the localization policies proved to be quite expensive.
Okay.
Joseph,
Yep.
this is where I talk about Taiwan's offshore wind development. And okay, in that case, let's rewind a little bit. This is where I'm going to tell you what happened in Taiwan. When I first started in Taiwan's offshore wind development, I actually thought that Japan was ahead of us, because I saw all these fancy manuals where they had incredibly intricate instructions about safety and what to do and what not to do. And I was just like, wow, Japan's so much ahead of us. It turns out their round one project, their first proper big offshore wind project, is not even supposed to be commissioned until 2030. So they were super actually far behind. Taiwan just kind of went ahead and did it. Like I was talking to, answering the question before, Taiwan just, when President Tsai got elected, took office in 2016, she just had a real problem on her hand because she committed to ending nuclear energy in 2025. And that meant that she had to make up this shortfall, and she decided to do it with offshore wind. So I said she made a very clear policy direction. She kind of had to, because there was no way we were going to get that source of low carbon energy from anywhere else. Because Taiwan is so small, the solar was extremely mature, just no place to put those panels. And the onshore just had a lot of NIMBYism concerns, which I understand is also happening in the United States. So offshore wind was the way to go. She sent an extremely clear policy direction, and her timing was really, really good. Because around 2014, the feed-in tariffs in Europe, as I understand it, they are tapering. A feed-in tariff is a kind of a sweetener for starting a new technology. So they were generous. The developers from Europe were definitely interested. They came and they were made to invest and do some technology transfer because we had the localization policy. I think she really thought it through in terms of, okay, we gotta have the electricity, but it's also a source of green electricity, and then it's also a source of jobs. So we were like, if you want to come here and do this business, you've got to make these components in Taiwan. Those they were phased in. And I would say the pinnacle of success for this whole program, like since I reported on it, like was the 2020 Ørsted TSMC deal, where they signed the biggest corporate power purchase agreement in the world for 20 years for this offshore wind farm. It's a pretty big offshore wind farm, 900 megawatts, something like that. And this was a really clever thing that they did, because now that whole wind farm is no longer supported by the taxpayers' super generous FIT. It's supported by TSMC, who actually need that green energy anyhow to continue selling into the Apple supply chain. Unfortunately, I would say I would characterize our offshore wind development as a very bold but very flawed. And the flawed part started showing up when I feel like our luck ran out a little bit. Taiwan handled COVID exceptionally well up to a certain point. And then it kind of got out into the community. They became very, very paranoid about keeping zero COVID. So the offshore wind vessels were treated like a potential source of contagion. Basically, all our constructions just came into a standstill. It was a terrible, terrible time. And just as when we thought we were going to emerge from that period, we got hit with more calamities. The Russia-Ukraine war, we know, triggered this commodities insanity gyration with prices going out of control and interest rates going out of control. And Taiwan's wind farms were already, due to localization requirements, some of the most expensive in the world. And all of a sudden, they crossed that line between being really expensive to being totally unworkable. And it was just not a matter of developers not wanting to build them. Even if they did, the banks didn't have the appetite for financing that anymore. So all of a sudden, I would say everything that you've been seeing elsewhere in the US and in Europe with developers wanting to withdraw from projects and costs going out of control is like it's hitting Taiwan. But more so, it's hitting Taiwan harder. It's hitting existing projects extremely hard. And it's creating a total atmosphere of fear and maybe kind of helplessness as we see how it's all going to unfold. My opinion, this is where the unlucky part continues, because we're starting in an elections cycle, and we won't know who the new president is until January, who the new administration is. So I would say that Taiwan's offshore wind development is at a crossroads. But having said that, let's end on a good note of accomplishment. And I think the accomplishment is really, it shows that a lot can get done within a few short years. Our plan was to get, starting from nothing really, when she came into office, there were preliminary plans, but nothing concrete. She was the one who said, go, go, go. And within her 8 years term, which is drawing to a close, we're seeing, like, Joseph was saying, a gigawatt in the water and change. And by 2025, we'll probably have 2 or 3 gigawatts out of the planned 5.5. So that is still an accomplishment, and we are still the leader in Asia. And while the localization policy,
maybe we can touch on localization in a bit, but I don't want to get too far ahead here. But yeah, that was very helpful. That was very helpful.
So I'll stop here. I feel like
it's great. I want to make sure we save time for the localization discussion. It was great though. And as you mentioned, providing certainty about policy direction is very important for kickstarting these industries. Policy tools such as a feed-in tariff are also very important. That's what Taiwan has done. That is interesting about the offshore wind and offshore wind vessels being restrained by COVID. That was not something I was aware of. I think that's obviously. I would assume that's. Would you characterize that as less of a problem now? Obviously, with
it's nobody cares now. Okay. Nobody cares.
Yeah, I figured that was the case. Okay, and so Shaq, I'll turn to you here. So Shaq, you're an expert on the Indian power sector. As I mentioned before, Shaq recently wrote a piece on solar in India, and I highly recommend that. So Shaq, actually, can you please elaborate on how India's offshore wind fits into its overall power mix? Obviously, India's doing a lot with both solar. There's a lot of legacy coal production. And the second part of this question, can you touch on why the southern state of Tamil Nadu is so important to India's offshore wind plants?
Thank you, Joe, and the Atlantic Council for inviting me to speak. So I think I'll start my remarks with just framing where India is. I think India, in terms of its energy transition as well as its scale, is pretty different than the rest of Asia. So broadly, the electricity consumption in India is about a third of the global average, and it's growing very rapidly. So that's like other countries in Asia, but again, when you're trying to deliver electricity to 1.4 billion people, a lot of solutions that may work for smaller markets are a drop in the bucket when it comes to India. The government has renewable energy goals that are very ambitious, about 500 gigawatts over the next, now it's 2023, so 7 years by 2030. So that's about 4 times current capacity. When it comes to wind, wind is a fairly small share of current capacity. It's only about 10% of that. It's going to grow substantially, but it will be dwarfed by solar. So, when it comes to offshore wind is kind of a potential to meet bottlenecks that the current wind industry overall in India is facing. So since 2017, wind has faced headwinds. One, it's just more expensive than solar. So if you are trying to meet very ambitious renewable energy targets, it's much easier to deploy solar. The other thing is in 2017, the government decided to redo the way they bid for projects. So it was reverse auction. Auctioning came in place, and so that drove down the cost of wind, at least on paper, to be much lower than what it would be to be profitable for many projects. And so, the benefit of that is there was more price discovery for wind projects. Before, it was kind of bilaterally negotiated contracts. However, because these prices are so low, a lot of companies don't want to invest in the sector when they could be putting that money in solar. Some of the other bottlenecks that India faces when it comes to wind currently right now is that there's a lot of dwindling onshore sites. So wind in general in India is very location and time dependent. So Western and Southern India have the best wind resources onshore and offshore. And most of the wind energy is actually produced during the Indian monsoon, which is about 3 months in the summer. in the Northern Hemisphere. And so offshore has the potential to kind of meet some of these bottlenecks. And the government, recently announced targets to bid for projects over the western state of Gujarat. And we're at least projected to see about 30 gigawatts, planned over the next 7 years or so, but they're very optimistic. So that brings me to the kind of the last part of your question, the state of Tamil Nadu. Overall, Tamil Nadu has the best offshore wind resources in India. However, putting it in a kind of global context, India's offshore resources are not as plentiful as, let's say, China, Europe, or North America. And overall, I think there's just a lot of uncertainty just because India is much further behind when it comes to deploying offshore wind than many other countries in Asia.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very useful. And as you mentioned, solar is much in the Indian context. Every market is different. Solar is much more prominent and important for India than offshore wind. As you mentioned, it's more of a niche capability. And Angelica maybe has talked with me before about Taiwan, the generation profile for offshore wind. As you mentioned, there's different generation profiles across different markets, which is really important to note. And so maybe we can turn back to Megan here and touch on permitting. So many European countries have this sort of one-stop shop approach for offshore wind permitting, which attempts to accelerate project deployment. And I was wondering if you could touch on that with regards to East Asia. How challenging are permitting times for project developers in East Asia and across Asia more broadly? And what can be done to shorten some of these review times?
So I think overall streamlining permitting and consenting is incredibly important. We are actually weirdly seeing in the UK and across Europe, we're seeing permitting times grow. So I think the earliest projects that were being developed here took a couple of years, 2-3 years in development. Now we're seeing an average of about 10, which is pretty bad, really, and has a massive impact on cost and also build out if you're delaying everything by 7 years. So making sure you get it right is really important. I think in East Asia, it's difficult to really comment because other than Taiwan, we aren't seeing huge amounts of commercial projects being built. China has a very different kind of process and is a very different type of market. But across the rest of Asia, I think Taiwan's the only kind of example that you can see. And it's difficult to comment on how long things are going to take until they take them. You don't know how many appeals are going to go through. You don't know actually how the system's going to work. So it's a huge challenge. It's something that we're seeing is a focus in Japan, certainly. I think, the permitting times in Taiwan aren't a deal breaker, but again, everything should be brought down all the time. In the UK, for example, we're seeing every single lease round, the Crown Estate reviews and refines and shortens timelines. Every single timeline they can shorten, they will bring out. And I think that's the approach that all offshore wind markets should take. The other point is the sort of permitting processes and timelines are highly dependent on the underlying legal and regulatory frameworks. We have like a kind of in Germany, in the Netherlands, you have this one-stop shop process. And that can speed things up quite significantly for developers. In the UK, we don't have that option. The seabed is not owned by or controlled by the government. It's owned in the UK. It's owned by the Crown, so the King. So the processes has to be separate, and in a lot of ways that's really beneficial, and in a lot of ways it causes problems. So again, it's just taking into account the local context and optimizing given that local environment is very important.
Yeah, that's terrific, and that's the theme I think we keep hitting on here is that every market is different. As you mentioned, different countries, different economies have different legal frameworks, and that really limits potentially what you can do and what you can't do. I think, as you mentioned, too, streamlining permitting time is extremely important. And I would argue that's especially important in the era of higher interest rates, as Angelica mentioned. Higher interest rates, and as you mentioned, Megan, are really pressuring project economics. And if you expand the timeline, that obviously has negative implications for project costs as well. So Angelica, we'll turn back to you here, and so now we can get into the localization discussion. I didn't want to jump the gun there, but so you've been very critical of Taiwan's localization policies, although your publication, Offshore Wind Unredacted, has also called this policy a quote double-edged sword, unquote. So can you unpack that for us a little bit? How has localization been a double-edged sword? What are some of the costs and what are some of the benefits in Taiwan's context?
Well, I'm going to get into the cost, but let me tell you about the benefits. I think that in terms of deciding where, let's say Siemens Gamesa, they are not going to build a factory in every single country. If they're setting up shop in Japan and Korea and Taiwan, I think Taiwan ended up with an edge in turbine manufacturing that now within the non-China Asia region that cannot be surpassed by even Korea. I think, although that is more easy, but I don't think Japan is even going to try. So obviously, I think that's a positive. You've got jobs, you've got technology transfer. That's tremendous. But I think the problem is, and also any kind of new technology, if you give people the jobs, if you give people the benefits, you'll create more political support. Of course, it's natural to want to give a little back to the community. Taiwan tried to do way too much, and it had a scattershot approach. It wasn't focused. It was saying we want this and that and this and that. And there are some components, such as foundations, where Taiwan is just like very not suitable for doing it. Made in Taiwan foundations are coming in at twice the price of made in Korea foundations. Plus, quite often they were behind, which is a horrible risk for projects. So I would say, if I can give some advice to the US, I don't know if it's too late. I heard that localization in the US is actually pretty extensive and very messy. Is just to be very, very thoughtful about how you do the localization, and especially how you don't create perverse incentives when you put in a localization regime. Because if a supplier knows that they have no choice, you have no choice but to buy from them, they're not going to give you top shelf quality and bottom cost. And that's our costs are already elevated for all those reasons we mentioned before. Offshore wind needs reasonable prices to go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about localization and redundancy in supply chain. So as you mentioned, Taiwan was one of the first economies to really implement a localization requirement. Taiwan and mainland China are both very active players in Asia in terms of the deployment of manufacturing capacity, but there's a lot of first mover advantages as well. So that's an interesting point in regards to Asia, and obviously that has implications for other economies as well. And so, Shaq, let's stay on this localization theme, but turn to India. And so India has a long history of localization. That has historical roots in Swadeshi or self-reliance. It's also increased, but it's also important to mention this localization trend is increasingly prevalent across many economies, including obviously the U.S. and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I will, I don't want to keep plugging this, but it is a really good report, the domestic solar manufacturing discussion which you published recently. At the same time, localization of the entirety of the offshore wind supply chain is very difficult and highly expensive. In the United States, Brazil, European countries are at the forefront of project development, despite considerable localization objectives. And so, we're in the U.S. we're interacting a lot with European companies and not necessarily homegrown domestic companies, and that hopefully will spur project development. But there are tensions between localization objectives and these measures. So I'll ask you, how is India balancing its localization objectives with leveraging European expertise, in particular on offshore wind project development?
Yeah, I think you've kind of hit the nail. You mentioned Swadeshi, which has very important roots in the history of India's independence from British rule. I think broadly, when it comes to offshore wind, a lot of policy stakeholders in India view localization as a way to reduce costs. And India's actually plays a part in the onshore and offshore wind supply chain globally. It's just a lot of that manufacturing doesn't happen for the local market. Some of it does, but some of it doesn't, especially for offshore wind. Overall, I think if you look at the government's strategy to take advantage of European expertise, and from a government to government perspective, there's already technical and development assistance from the European Union and Denmark, and a lot of the government of India's policy documents to kind of frame what the sector will look like, the technical analysis, the supply chain analysis. A lot of those are actually funded by these development and assistance agreements with the EU. One of the things European companies, either themselves or in joint ventures in India, already have a sizable share of the onshore wind manufacturing market. So about half of wind manufacturing in India is actually through European markets, and so there is that potential that given future offshore wind projects in India, a lot of that expertise can be tapped, and that's kind of the recommendation that's been put forth from these supply chain analysis that the EU have done, is that likely given the technical expertise needed, that European companies will play a role to help Indian companies. It at face value, it kind of makes sense since they're already in the market. I think one last comment about all of this is when it comes to localization and supply chains, I think in wind, it's not so much, it's not as much as of a risk, but China is kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to solar. I think so much of the Indian solar kind of story has been underpinned by cheap Chinese exports of solar technology. For wind, it's not as much of an issue, and we see that kind of trend of more friendlier countries, let's say the United States, EU, India. I would see that at least there might be potentially more of an appetite to reduce some of those localization requirements, or they won't be as acute as they are for potentially solar, just because you have friendly countries providing some of that material into the future.
Yeah, those are great points. And as you mentioned, solar is much more tradable than wind turbines. There's a more favorable weight to value ratio for solar than there is for offshore wind for these massive structures. So much more trade in solar than there is with wind turbines. And that's a very good point too about, I wasn't aware of it, with European technical assistance, European development, and just the fraction of Europe share in onshore markets is already pretty sizable in India. And so before we open up for more questions here, Megan, I want to turn you on transmission specifically, because this is a huge bottleneck in the US. It's emerging as a bottleneck for a lot of economies across the world. And so I want to get your input here. Do you have any advice for regional policymakers as they navigate integrating new offshore wind generation capacity and integrating that into their electricity grids?
So I think one of the main sort of highlights that I would like to say to any policymakers around the world on looking at transmission is who pays and how, and the system for grid connection needs to be really clear, really transparent as early as possible. Actually, who pays and where that risk lies is, I would argue, less important than the clarity and consistency of whatever policy gets put in place. It can be changed subsequently, but for any given development, it needs to be really, really clear, because when you look at the transmission side of things, the cost is 25 to 35% of the cost of the entire wind farm, depending on the design. It's a really sizable chunk, and it can be quite a hidden cost as well. If you're expecting the grid operator to bear that cost, are they able to? Is there is it technically feasible as well? Are your offshore wind farms likely to be located, or are the onshore grid connection points likely to be located near to centres of demand? If not, and what we're seeing for example, we're doing a lot of grid development work in Colombia at the moment, looking at how offshore wind can be brought in, because the centres of demand are not close to where those onshore grid connection points are likely to be. So you then have the additional sort of discussion about the sort of onshore grid reinforcement. So there are many different models of how you can bear those costs and manage those costs. So, for example, in the Netherlands and in Germany, the onshore grid operator bears the cost, designs and develops that sort of grid connection all the way to the offshore connection point. So the developers don't really have to think about anything. That works in some ways. Developers don't have to bother with it, but they also, it can be seen as a risk as well, because if the developers don't have control over that connection, then if the connection is not there by the time they get the wind farm built, they are losing millions daily. So that's going to be a problem. In the UK, we have a different model where the developer designs and builds the grid connection to the onshore connection point, which in the early days, actually, of development within offshore wind development, developers liked a lot more than the European model, the sort of mainland European model of it being sort of centrally managed, because they could control it. Even though it cost them more, they could control it. Therefore, the risk to them was lower. And so that was more attractive to them. As their confidence in the grid operators being able to do this has increased, they would rather not have to build it. But there are pros and cons either way. So, but underlying all this, as I said before, the systems and the processes and of how that grid connection will happen and be funded needs to be clear, consistent, transparent, and efficient as well. And that needs to happen early on, because it's such a large part of the cost and such a large part of the risk. Any changes to it can really spook investors. So being sort of having that robustly developed early on is incredibly important.
Yeah, that's a really important point about having clear and consistent messaging with regards to transmission. And you mentioned that up to transmission can be 25 to 30% of the cost. Obviously that can vary also depending on the distance between the generation and the demand center. So yeah, as you mentioned, hugely important. And there's a lot of interest in some of the questions on floating offshore wind technology. So as Megan, I think you mentioned earlier, floating is much more prevalent in Asia, rather much more to a much greater degree than we see in the United States or Europe. So one question we have is, how achievable is floating offshore wind as a future technology, and are we advanced enough to implement this efficiently in the future? So big question. I know it's very, very technical, but it also does have major implications potentially for Asia. So I'll turn that to the panel. Megan, would you like to start tackling this? And I know it's a very technical question, but I'll turn to you first.
I'm happy to take that first. I think floating offshore wind is a proven technology now. We have commercial wind farms in Scotland here. It's the costs of floating offshore wind are higher than fixed, but are coming down very, very, very rapidly. It has huge advantages over fixed in certain markets, especially markets where you have seismic risk, because sort of earthquake isn't going to bother a floating offshore wind farm at all. So there are huge advantages. I think, I guess about 5-6 years ago in the UK, we were talking about whether floating offshore wind is going to happen, a bit like we were talking about whether electric vehicles are going to happen, right? And I think it's fair to say we are at the point now that floating offshore wind is happening and will happen, like electric vehicles are happening and will happen.
Yeah, those are great points. So as you mentioned, floating is commercially viable. There are commercial projects for it. At the same time, the costs are higher than fixed bottom turbines. And as you mentioned, which I was not aware of, but there's huge advantages in a seismic market, or in a market where there's substantial seismic activity. Obviously, there's a lot of that in Asia. I know in the US, there's some interest in floating offshore wind, obviously in California, which has very deep waters, but also even in the U.S. Gulf Coast, because there's concern about hurricanes, and there's some discussion about shifting shifting these turbines, out of the path of a hurricane. I don't know if that's technically feasible, but there has been some discussion about that. So, Angelica or Shaq, would you like to comment on floating offshore wind? I know it's a very, very technical question here, but I welcome any comments you all have on this matter.
I'll go ahead and say there's so much uncertainty with fixed offshore wind in India that I don't see it being part of any kind of, at least in the short term, any part of the mix.
I just like to say that I hope that Megan's right, but I think it all depends on whether the spike in costs we're seeing in bottom fixed, which I believe is always going to be cheaper than floating. Let's see if this increasing cost is going to go away and we can go back to costing down, or if it's going to be enduring. Because if it is going to be enduring, then floating offshore wind is still going to be so expensive. And I feel like because I'm more on the ground and maybe sees a little bit further, but I just see that there's still a huge technology risk. You can't tell me what kind of foundation you're going to use. There's still so many projects out there that have timelines, and this is when we're going to build it, and they don't know how they're going to float their floater. So in my mind, there's still enormous doubt. I don't think it's a set deal, because it doesn't matter if it works. Does it cost out? Does it pencil out? But at some point, we do run out of bottom fixed space. In Taiwan, we're starting to get close. So there will be a ceiling to how many offshore wind farms we can have unless we get floating right.
Yeah, those are great points about, just there's limited infrastructure, there's limited spaces to put fixed bottom turbines, and so floating, even for Taiwan, has a lot of implications. So we have a question also on the wind energy supply chain. So as all of you know, Siemens Energy's had some troubles recently, and specifically in the context of Asia. Are there any parts of the supply chain that keep you awake at night, or that you're very concerned about in the Asian context? And so, Angelica, I know you mentioned previously about offshore wind vessels having, code restrictions that has since passed. But are there any areas of concern we should be focusing on?
Let's talk about the Siemens release. And they said, what did they say? They said that the reason why they ran into those troubles, which is stacking up into billions in repair costs that they weren't anticipating, fortunately for their onshore turbines, not the offshore models have been affected. But why did they say they ran into trouble? They went too fast. They started rolling out platform after platform, the turbine wars, because, every time you come up with a bigger platform, your levelized cost of energy goes down compared to your competitors. And so you get a huge edge. But what happens is when everybody's trying to build bigger, there's not enough time to integrate the supply chain, consolidate the supply chain, and get on that learning curve where you really know what you're doing. And you're baking in uncertainty down the line. My fear is that those turbines, whatever happened to the onshore turbines, might one day happen to the offshore turbines by the time the repair costs might be enormous. I, by the way, would love to see, I don't know if it's possible because there are market forces that are beyond anybody's control. If there can be some coordinated slowing down of the rate where the platforms are just getting bigger, 8 megawatts, we've gone past that, 10 megawatts, now 15, and now they're already eyeing the 18. So that is going to have an effect too in terms of constrained installation vessel supply, which is very, very tight.
You're not the only one who's wondered about kind of slowing the arms race in terms of capacity size of wind turbines. I think that's true across the industry. Megan or Shaq, do you have any comment about things that in the offshore wind supply chain that keep you awake at night? Or we can touch on hydrogen as well if that's more of interest, and offshore wind's implications for hydrogen.
I mean, I think from my perspective, the biggest question on the supply chain is how do we move from kind of bespoke output to fully industrialized sort of market? How do we move from the kind of project by project to the real rolling out at scale of offshore wind? And this is on a global scale, right? This isn't just looking at the Asian market. It's something we need to do within Europe and in the US and around the world. And that's going to be a global effort as well to achieve that. And that's going to require very different ways of doing things. You know, at the moment we're seeing, you know, within fixed, we're moving from, you know, the early ones were being installed, you know, take a week to install a turbine, and now they're in within 12 hours. So, you know, you can churn them out. But again, we're seeing, like with floating wind, it's taking a week currently. We need to get that as a matter of hours as well. It's doable, but it's that step change, right? That change of gear, and probably about 5 changes of gear actually, from okay, we're pootling along, but actually we really need to go forward. And how the supply chain is then going to support that rapid acceleration of deployment that we really need to do to keep the market going. I know Angelica mentioned earlier, she sees the sort of Taiwanese market as a bit of a crossroads. We're seeing that within Europe as well, very much so. And I would say that sort of, we're at a really interesting, to put it politely, point within the global market. And we really need to overcome this bit of a hump, because from the offshore wind industry perspective, but also from this kind of global decarbonization perspective, you know, offshore wind's a really good solution, and we have to make it work, and it can work. There's the economics are there. It's just how we achieve it.
Yeah, and maybe that's something we should touch on too. Is, you know, Megan, if you just your opinion on that, why is offshore wind a particularly good decarbonization tool for the world?
Because it's scalable, for one. You know, it's not going to be the only thing we're going to be able to rely on. You know, solar's well proven. You know, landlocked countries obviously are going to be dealing with offshore wind, but to a large extent, a lot, you know, many countries do have significant coastline and significant offshore resource, especially sort of those with a heavier kind of energy requirement. In the route to decarbonisation, we're seeing an increasing electrification of the system, and therefore that will also sort of require more energy. Again, offshore wind is scalable. Onshore wind is fantastic too, and will be a huge part of the mix, and you know, our numbers offshore significantly at the moment, but the complexities of doing large scale onshore is huge, because you have so many like land agreements, impact studies and all that sort of stuff. Offshore, you have one landowner, you have one permitting process, and you can build 2 gigawatts wind farms in one go with relative ease. You know, in Europe, the wholesale cost of offshore wind is the cheapest form of energy, second only to onshore wind in Europe now. You know, it's cheaper than gas, it's cheaper than coal, you know, so, and it's cheaper than solar. It's also fairly reliable. That's, you know, all renewable energy sources there is an element of unreliability, but offshore wind, generally speaking, especially if you go further offshore, the wind speeds are pretty good, and you can have a good idea of, you know, forward planning of when your wind speed's going to be high, when they're going to be low. It's pretty resilient as well. So this kind of global scalability and viability is really, 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 really important. So we can all learn lessons from each other. So there are many good factors, and it's already been proven within Europe that it can be a very low cost, very high scale deployment, and very successful as well.
Yeah, those are great points on scalability and reliability, and that's also a really good point on the you know, there's one owner of offshore wind compared to onshore wind, which could have multiple land uses. And Angelica mentioned in Taiwan having a lot of NIMBY problems. That is not unique to Taiwan at all. NIMBY is not in my backyard for those who are not aware, and that's a problem across the world here. So Shaq, I'll get you in here too. So Megan mentioned about offshore wind as a decarbonization solution. I'm interested in offshore wind as a potential industrial decarbonization solution, particularly with regards to hydrogen, not just electrification, but also green hydrogen. So does offshore wind figure into India's green hydrogen profile? There's, with offshore wind, there can be some anti-correlation between solar and onshore versus offshore wind. So there's that could potentially maximize or at least improve electrolyzer economics. So when India's looking at offshore wind, you mentioned it's a very niche fuel, but is offshore wind part of the green hydrogen discussion in India?
I think in abstract it is, but I think the hydrogen discussion in India is pretty interesting because India also has very ambitious plans to have green hydrogen, potentially be an exporter. Also, some ambitious plans to have domestic manufacturing of electrolyzers. But the question in my mind is, at the end of the day, all the numbers need to add up, right? So if you look at wind, if you look at solar, and then you look at those are the potential supplies, and then you have demand for electricity, either surging electricity demand, households, commercial, and then subset of that is hydrogen. I think the open question and uncertain question to many have been, if you're putting in a lot of this electrolytic hydrogen and the renewables to accompany that, wouldn't that be better served to substitute coal, at least in the short term? And I think if you talk to stakeholders in India, especially the government, they'll say, no, power demand is growing so much that we're going to need the coal anyways. And that's true to some extent, but I think even the power demand forecasts, they're high, but they're again a lot of uncertainty, and so it's yet to be seen of exactly are we going to have those substitutions. So I guess to summarize my answer to your question, it would be no, not really, but that the coal question is really tied into that. Is if you're building out renewables, shouldn't that be going to substitute some of the coal supply?
Yeah, those are great points, and that's true in the U.S. as well. So we wrote a paper on U.S. industrial decarbonization not too long ago, and coal accounts for in about 91% of coal consumption is for the electricity sector. So greening the electricity sector arguably should be a higher priority than hydrogen. So that's obviously here, and the U.S. and also India is also a major coal consumer as well. So Angelica, we have about 5 minutes left. So really quickly, and then I'll turn, if we can, we'll squeeze in a question here. Angelica, there's important stakeholder management issues around offshore wind. And so I was wondering if you could talk in Taiwan, what has Taiwan done to achieve societal buy-in from fisheries, other stakeholders? I mean, obviously there's a lot of stakeholders across Taiwan in regarding offshore wind. So what has Taiwan done to ensure that all these folks come along for offshore wind?
Great difficulty. There's a lot of, obviously, everywhere you go, it is the same. But in Taiwan, you've got all these government departments, and they don't necessarily have an incentive to work with each other. I think what they did very correct was they made former Vice Premier Shen Rongjing the point man of offshore wind development in Taiwan. And he was passionate about it, and he had enough political clout because he was vice premier to actually kind of broker agreement within all those different government departments and make things move. I don't know what the US equivalent to that would look like. But in Taiwan, that really helped a lot in consolidating things. But I won't lie, it is just an eternal struggle when you've got everybody from, Department of Agriculture care about the fisheries, and then you've got, the military cares about whether it's too close to an airport or not. That's the military uses, and and then of course environmental, all the different cetaceans that might be affected or harassed. It can add up to a lot. So one thing that they did to basically try to streamline the process. Is they at a project even before it goes into EIA, they have a meeting with representatives from all the government departments, and it's just like, okay, if you have any objections, let's raise them now before it goes into EIA, and that kind of streamline things a little bit.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we have, in the interest of time here, I'll just turn to each of you for closing comments. So just, a minute, keep it relatively brief if you can. Megan, let's start with you.
Hard to summarize in a minute. I think I guess that one of the key things to focus on for sort of offshore wind development in the region going forwards is this kind of idea of visibility and forward planning. I mean, I think Angelica made a really good point earlier in that I think Taiwan's a really good success story, and a lot of that was that political drive, right? That commitment and that early consistent approach of supporting the industry. It's a similar thing that we saw in the UK. That really consistent approach, and that's what you want, and that's what attracts investors. The bottom line is you need to make this industry investable for those kind of huge amounts of money that needs to build it. And so that should not, that should not, we shouldn't lose sight of that. Within that, there are loads of ways of doing it, but that sort of focus on how to make this most attractive to investors. And I think, offshore wind has a great future and has a huge amount to offer. So it's just a question of getting it right. We've seen it being done well enough in certain markets. So I think it's got a really bright future, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Yeah, that's good to hear some optimism. Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier in your comments, it's important for policymakers to strongly back offshore wind, but also provide clarity and consistency, including with regards to transmission. So some great points. And Shaq, I'll turn it over to you, and then Angelica, you'll close us out.
Yeah, I think I'd close off with this. Might sound like a broken record, a little trite, but just the policy certainty. I think in India, there's so much, there's so much uncertainty of who will do what. For example, the issue of who's building the transmission line. Even backing up from that, there's still blocks, in the sea that still haven't been done. The surveys haven't been done. And the government has said, private developers will be in charge of doing a lot of those. And so there's been a little just push back and forth between who is responsible for certain parts and who's going to take the risk. And coming out with kind of a clear, definitive kind of plan for that, I think is yet to be seen. There's kind of pieces of it, but there's still kind of unresolved issues. And if policymakers can take the leadership and have the will to clear those up, I think you'll see a little bit more investment in the space.
Yeah, no, that's good to reinforce that message of providing certainty is very important for investors, and this energy transition will most likely be investor led, but obviously policy support is important as well. So Angelica, I'll turn to you for closing comments.
My comments are for the Taiwan market, but maybe for the world as well. We're in such a turbulent time, and we're coming to the end of a really aggressive period of growth and creation and new factories, new ways of working. I would really like to see the offshore wind industry undergo real period of finding that stability again before we can be aggressive. Where do we find ways to be profitable and stable and get our projects done and off our plates? Where do we find that stability? Is it cutting back a bit on localization? Is it a little bit more government support here and there? Or I don't know what it is, but I strongly believe that for the offshore wind industry to thrive for the long term, maybe it's time not to be so aggressive. Make sure every part of the supply chain, some of which have been really stretched really hard, make sure everybody's making some money and have a clear way forward. That's the only way to continue in a sustainable manner.
Provocative point and well taken. Yeah, so thank you all three for joining us today. These are I've learned a lot in this discussion. Really want to thank you all for joining us. I know, Angelica, I know it's very late over in Taiwan where you're based, and thank you for this terrific discussion. We look forward to continuing these in the future. Thank you again, and see you later.